heroes that potentially need reworks, because I couldn't see like Malga working, you know,
Cap.
like or
Cap.
you know,
Cap.
even heroes
Cap.
that I think are
Cap.
great. Like
6v6
On a
code
game
proves
team,
this
it's not, you don't have
immediately.
infinite in the world of 6v6, suddenly does Winston lose his alternate fire, you know?
Nope.
It's like,
Those
probably
changes,
not. It's just like,
didn't matter. They didn't matter at all.
Or you're the solo support on a 2-2-1 team, and you have to do all that healing. Do you need something too? I think there's a question there, something we might experiment with too.
There we
So,
go, Alec. Okay,
that
you're
in
getting
particular,
interesting here.
you
You've
know,
piqued
we
my
see a lot of
interest,
other
Alec.
product people
Outside
actually
the
flex
box. Look
that
at that.
So, Flats, I'd like you to kick us off. As you already said, we've kind of got a rough running order, and I think this will be a good and productive one to start with. Go ahead, take over.
Sure. Man, we're gonna start hard and heavy here, I guess. But you know, I think it's kind of the elephant in the room, and I've really wanted to talk about it for a long time. And Overwatch does not have the best reputation among the greater gaming community. You know, obviously there's the whole Steam thing and whatnot, and just post Overwatch 2 and all that kind of, or post PV Overwatch 2, all that stuff. So
Mods,
what would
you
you
can change
do?
the game.
What do you want to do to maybe move past that and maybe begin to repair the lost trust within the game and the community?
Here we go. This is like, I see how this is gonna go now, you know?
No fluff questions here. No fluff questions here.
Yeah, exactly. It's a
I think
it's
Aaron's a
great
good dude,
question,
though.
you know. I guess I would start by, you know, agreeing with you, you know. So there is I think that there is a reputation that we have, at least like I think maybe in the broader gaming space, and I don't want to push back on that. I don't think I want to I don't need to go back too much into the history. Like I obviously have a history, like I have a habit of doing that myself if you've read the blog piece, right? But you know, like I think that the community has some valid things that they can point at for Overwatch, you know, and for Overwatch 2. And so I think that it is much easier to lose trust than to build trust, right? And we've had a saying that we used to talk about it. I think a little bit more on the Overwatch team is you're only as good as your last release, you know. And so you could be just like, you know, just knocking it out of the park, you know, patch after patch after patch, and if you get a bad one, people don't give you a whole lot of credit for it, you know. And I'm obviously not, our reputation just isn't just based off of, you know, good or bad patches, but like I think to move forward here, it requires us to have like a pretty solid vision for what the game ought to be going forward, you know. And I think we talked about it a little bit at BlizzCon. And I think we can talk about it a little bit more today, you know, like what the vision of the game is going forward. And it's us like really
He's put his neck out there. I'll
pursuing
give him
that.
credit. You know?
But then at the same time, like having as much consistent and transparent communication with our community.
Ollie
as
Drama,
we
what's up,
can.
dude? Good to
So
see you.
I think that for us, it's a more of a long-term strategy of continue to make the game that that vision of the game for Overwatch better, you know, and to continually grow it and make it, you know, more of that game that all of our players want to play, and then getting in front of our players like we're doing today, like we've done in a lot of our blog pieces, and just talking about it.
Yeah, it's about following through, you know, say what we're doing, actually
Shout out
actually
Alec,
on
dude.
that. I think Aaron talked about it a little bit, but being more clear about the game we're making, and then seeing that being realized within the game itself with the release of features and you know how we go about balance as well.
When SUV talks
And then
about it.
finally surprising our players with things that they don't even expect. I think that's really important for us to take big swings later on in Overwatch to show you like where the vision's going in the next few years too. I think a lot of it is currently we look at the game and we understand that players think there's really great content coming out. I mean, I'm so excited for Juno, obviously at the background, but it can't just be the cadence of hero release, and maps and continue that for a number of years. It has to be some other stuff too.
What do you think? Like, either one of you, like, what would you do?
Flats, you go first.
I'd get back
Okay.
to 6v6. I mean, it's a start.
I think Alex is 100% right. It can't be just hero every 4 or 5 months and maps every other season. especially with like how competitive the gaming space is. Everyone's fighting for someone's attention. And even, even if like personally you might feel like if you felt Overwatch was in a good place, overall, like eventually people get bored of just the same thing over and over and over, and something new to spark their attention really does bring like life back to it. I look to like Fortnite when they did like their revamp of like going back on like the original release, and yeah, they prey on nostalgia with that and that kind of stuff, but like that was a big moment for them. It did bring a lot of players back, it did bring a lot of excitement back, and I'm not saying like Overwatch needs to do that, although I'm sure there's tons of people that would want that. They would just something big enough to like move the needle, because even though like Overwatch has changed a lot in the past 2 years, in some ways like very much for the better, even though people may not know that, or they don't know communications, or they don't know about the balance, or they don't know like how often this kind of stuff happens.
I don't think balance
they don't
is
even
great
want to come
right
back
now.
and give it a chance, right? But like if something big enough comes, then they might try it, and they like, oh, like this actually could be good, and that could be something that's in the game, some kind of major change, or like we're going to talk about it here, 6v6. Like 6v6 is a giant format change. Like something like that is big enough to like, oh, like that could get people's attention. Or even something out of the game where you're like, people always talk about having a TV show, or like whatever happened to like the cinematics, because like early Overwatch there were so many cinematics and it would just hit, and it just doesn't really feel like there's as much of that anymore. Honestly, if I had to choose, I would do both together at the same time. And fighting for people's attention
they did a good job with
live
season
free-to-play
9,
game
by
is
the way.
really, really difficult. I'm very lucky to not have to do that job.
That's what season 9
but
was.
yeah, I think it's honestly a combination of a few things, but I mostly agree with Alec that it's just got to be something big.
You kind of have to do that job. It's just like in a different way.
Give too much credit.
I'll be very quick and succinct, because I want to get to more of you guys' answers. I think I agree with the things you guys said. I think so. Just to summarize as well, what you guys said: more open communication, like paint a clear vision and then deliver on it, and then also bring some surprises. So I think all those things are really good. I think ultimately, whatever players you bring in and out, they have to be satisfied with
Their
the game
Ramatra
they're
trailer
playing.
was
So I think
sick.
the game has to satisfy the players, and then I would think, big picture, we need to make people fall in love with the Overwatch heroes again, because I think it's a big open statement, but what drew people early was the like, oh my god, I love the Dragon Short, I love Genji, I love Hanzo, I love seeing what they're doing, I love Mercy. Obviously, it's very easy for me to sit here and say, yeah, I want that TV show, as Flat's already mentioned, I want that Netflix show. I think I've told you guys this directly as well, that I think it's a big thing. But anything I think that you guys can do to make players fall in love with the heroes again. We know PvE is kind of not happening in the way it was going to happen. But I think we need to fall in love with Overwatch again, I think, is the TLDR. Anything you guys want to add before we move to your
A lot of
next
people
question?
care about the Netflix show. A
Alec
lot of
and
people care.
Aaron.
The game comes
I
first,
think
but
we could probably start talking about just like the vision for Overwatch.
Yeah.
Yeah,
If,
actually, that
like,
was
I'm
gonna
really
be my
curious
next
what he's
question.
gonna say. Let's
Yes,
listen.
that's perfect. Because I'll just set up the question, which is that we're about 8 years in now, right? This is about to be the 8th year of Overwatch, and I think I look to the other games that have been out for this long, like League of Legends, like Dota, Counter-Strike. It feels like they have a pretty clear definition of like, this is what the game is. Like this is what you sign up for when you play. I personally I find that changes a lot with Overwatch. It has changed a lot, as you kind of alluded to in your blog, Aaron. Like the format changed so much. We went from like 6 Winstons to now we're 5v5 and 1 tank, 2-2. What to you guys is the core identity of Overwatch? Like, what does it boil down to when you strip everything else away? What
Combos
was
were
it
so much
always
fun.
being achieved or aimed to be? And yeah, I imagine you'll say that it's changed a lot, but if so, where do you think it lands now?
Yeah, this is a big one, right? This is like, we could talk about this one for a long time.
It's very open-ended too, is
like,
the hard part.
In short, I think, Overwatch, like what we want it to be is just the best team-based, competitive, hero-based arena shooter that we can make it, right? PvP arena shooter that we can make it. And I think that there's a competitive nature to our game that's integral to the enjoyment of it. And you're right, it has changed over time. Like, it was the game when it first launched, like it had no hero limits, right? For months. I think it was
2 months.
I think it was November of 2016 before that was finally included in quick play, right? So it's like there was a part of like the original like essence or the original soul of what Overwatch was that was a little bit crazier, a lot crazier than what it is right now, you know? And we have a design value at Blizzard, which is like the right decisions change over time, you know? And you can kind of look back at the history of Overwatch, I think, and see where like I don't really know if it would have been the right thing to do to ship Overwatch with role queue, let's say, you know, but like you can see why it became the right decision for the game. And so I think that we are in a place right now where the game, the player base that we have, it's a fairly competitive player base.
I'm not sold on that yet.
They're pretty invested in the game. And I think that the direction that we go in the future is to serve like this set of players and to continually improve upon the game experience that we have right now. You talked about some of the other games that have come out, you know, in the meantime, right? And there's games that have come out, and then there's competitive games that have been out for a long time. I think that have some things maybe that Overwatch is missing a bit. And one of those things is either like we talk about this internally a lot, either like a greater strategic depth or player agency. And when you look at it, there is a lot of strategic depth to Overwatch, but a lot of that is like putting together your team composition. Once you get into the match, it really is like executing, right? And there's not, besides like swapping to another hero, there's not like a ton of other choices to make. And like you have a lot of other games where there might be other choices to make inside of that. That was part of what the pickable passives, quick play hacks was trying to get at. Are there other systems that we could potentially put into this game that give players more agency or that start giving the game a little bit more strategic depth to it? Overwatch also, it is incredibly fast paced. There's a lot going on, so it's like I think we can only do a certain amount of that.
You won't change the
at
gameplay
any one
loop with
time
super tanks
before
in the
people
game.
start getting overloaded. But we're starting to look at that, and so it kind of gets into like as we talk about the future for Overwatch, we think that that we always ought to be working on at least like one big bet for this game.
That's fair.
And there are some, I think, some really exciting things that are happening right now internally, you know? So it's like, I guess like I agree with you of like, what is that magic? You know, how do you introduce people to this magic of Overwatch? I think we have some ideas on some things that we could release to do that. And so for us, like, I know this is kind of going long, sorry, but
no, it's a long conversation.
You start looking at like, what are the things we can do to the core game to start either improving it from a competitive standpoint or doing things like adding strategic depth or player agency to it in or out of the game. That could also be something like a map voting system. And then what are the really big bets that we can make on Overwatch as well to like kind of like really expose Overwatch outside of like our community, this like very invested hardcore community. There's a much bigger gaming community outside of that, and there's a lot of opportunities to, I think, reintroduce Overwatch, the PvP shooter, to that community.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think even when you look at conversations on the team within probably the last 6 months of like where the focus has shifted, it's been much more, you can kind of like almost see these words on the wall, like we're a social competitive game, you know? And that starts to lead some of the things we're talking about in more seriousness than maybe we did previously. I think there's a lot more serious conversations around bans, more serious conversations around tournaments, more serious conversations around map voting. I think a lot of that might have been a little like, oh, that would be nice in the past, but I think now those are things that are top of mind that we want to actually try to build towards eventually, you know? And I think even looking at the social part of that, I think one of our goals right now as a game is to restore the social fabric within the game. I think that's been something that we recognize has been lost over time. And, you know, games come out at different times. I think even the way people communicate has changed, right? Just look at how many people are in Discord now compared to, you know, when Overwatch first launched and how people communicate through that versus like in-game chat, right? but there are things we need to do to make it feel more like a social experience than it previously did as well. So I think those are some of the things that just come into focus a lot more, and where you'll see some of the resources go.
Yeah, and I think, like it might be interesting to talk a bit, and like interrupt at any time if you want to like move on.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
No,
Finish
you're
your thought,
good.
Aaron, and
I'm
then
loving
we'll,
this.
We'll
Okay.
Yeah, we'll move on once we're ready.
It's probably good to even define what competitive means, because like that is a term that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, right? And I think even in gaming, there's probably a spectrum of competitive games out there, and it's like you put like a game, let's say like Counter-Strike or something like that, that's kind of like pegged pretty far to the end of that spectrum in how competitive it is. And like there's multiplayer games out there where I guess you compete against each other, but they're really just about the fun rather than the competition. Like you're going to go play Mario Party or something like that. Like it's kind of hard to call that a competitive game even though you're competing. And so there is like this spectrum that you kind of I think it's important to kind of like know where you exist on that and kind of like how do you place yourself. And I think we are I don't think Overwatch itself is the game that we are trying to peg all the way on one side of that. Like, and if you're saying like, let's say the right side of that graph is the most competitive you can get and the left side's the least, we are closer to the right. I don't think we're in the middle or anything like that. So it's like we treat our game as a competitive experience. And we want people to have that sort of like that spirit and like that
why are half the heroes designed the way they are?
seriousness a lot of times when they play it. But it's
There's
not
nothing serious
all the
about
way
Alari
over
Pylon.
on the right side.
There's nothing serious about Immortality Field.
Last, do you mind if this is the second? We're gonna start going ad hoc now. I think we have to like scrap some of our plan. 'Cause there's some
I
interesting
was thinking
things
the
there
same thing.
that I wanna dig into.
The hero design
do you mind if
philosophy
I
they
ask a quick
have
follow-up on that, and then you
goes
ask me a
directly
quick
against
follow-up?
that, though.
You're good.
I like that you kind of define this idea of like we're a competitive social shooter. When you say competitive, what do you mean? Like, is it like people playing just comp? Is it pro play? Like, is it people only in top 500? Is it diamond? Like, where is
It's
comp?
everybody.
And whose experience is the
It's
competitive
everybody.
experience
It's everybody.
talking about?
It's everybody.
So good because there's the experience of playing a game, just like the actual release of the game, and then there can be for a lot of games a different ecosystem around that game, like a competitive ecosystem around that game. And so I think a lot of times what we're talking about is just the actual game of Overwatch and not necessarily a lot of the
It doesn't have to be
other
specific.
competition that's
Like
happening
gold
with
players
it.
who are in and out,
And there is a range inside Overwatch
they can be very
as
competitive.
well. Like when
Like the swing players are
you look
competitive.
at how serious people are in ranked and how serious they're going to be in quick play, it's different. It's going to be different for every person, that's playing. Like there's a lot of people that treat quick play as their main competitive format of Overwatch, and it is actually our most popular game mode. Like more people play quick play than play comp, but not everybody treats it that same way. And so like we have to recognize that we're not going to be able to there's not going to be a one size fits all approach for this. And so I think that there is something really interesting about kind of having this range of competitiveness that we offer people in the game. But also we have to be cognizant that like people kind of play it for different reasons. So for us, like ranked, and like as you start getting into high levels of ranked, we treat that as an experience that we really need to protect the competitive integrity of it, and we put a lot of our efforts around balance even and hero design into like making sure that side of the game stays as competitive as we can make it. But then as we start looking at some other parts of it, we want people to be able to have serious games of Overwatch. It's just not going to be quite as serious as it is when you get into comp.
The hero design, though,
Alec,
does
anything you
not
want to add for
back
a
that
last
up,
follow-up?
though.
Okay,
I get what he
awesome.
means, and I
Flats, go ahead.
agree.
Anything you want to add to what was
But why are play for you
Not
abilities
really a ton,
stronger than
just,
ever then?
I personally think that quick play should be like way less of a comp system. I know most people play it, I know whatnot, but at least to me as a
what's put
mostly
in
former
practice isn't what he's
competitive player at this
preaching
point.
right
I don't
now.
even play it that much anymore. I've always viewed his quick play as like the more fun, have a good time with friends, like play with like off rolls type of game mode. But it does feel like as Overwatch 2 has gone on, it's almost like ranked light. And I don't know if that totally is the vibe that should be going for it, because sometimes you just want to load up and like play your off roll or play something else, and it's like sometimes you feel like you kind of have to just lock in, right? Because like the game is so much harder. And maybe it's just me not misremembering like Overwatch 1 leading into Overwatch 2 didn't totally feel as, I don't know, sweaty, I guess is a good word of maybe saying it. So that's at least how I feel about it, because I think the competitive side should always be competitive and like you said before, have that competitive integrity to it and really, you know, be protected. Though I do think there are some things that could be done with it. Like, for example, top 500 doesn't really feel that competitive. I barely play ranked anymore, and I can, as long as I finish my 50 wins, I can easily hold it, and I don't even think I deserve it at the moment. Like, it's really not that difficult. And so there's probably some things maybe even on that side that could be looked at, but I think that's for another time.
We used to talk about like a third queue, you know, like, hey, is there like ranked quick play and like the thing under quick play, or the thing in between quick play and ranked? Yeah, so like there we used to have a lot of discussions around it, and maybe it's time to talk about those some more. Like, some of the downsides to it is like the more queues we introduce, you know, like the more it kind of splits up the player base. And then players also, they self-select into the one that they think that they ought to be playing. So in any one of those, you're still going to get, because there's people in comp that treat it just as like a, you know, the clown car version of a game where they're just doing whatever they want to, right? And so like you would still have people in every one of those treating it just as serious as they do. And so like when we used to talk about it, we never really acted on it because we thought it might just play out the same as what we've got right now, with people asking for a fourth queue after we introduce the third one.
Yeah, it's a bit of Pandora's box.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
I don't think they need to do that, to be honest.
Okay.
It'd be cool, but like, I don't think they
anything you want
need
to add
to.
before we move to our next question?
Honestly, it's something like we have difference of opinion on the team at times, which is like how much should comp and quick play differ. I mean, I think when we talk about like feature systems, you know, sometimes a lot of us are like, these should be comp only. Like, make
Quick
sure
play is
that,
too
like, more
competitive right now. It's not fun.
crunchy systems are actually like only.
Quick play in
comp.
Overwatch
That's
1 was
experience
way
drafting. It's
better.
gonna be like the
Way
lighter
better.
version of Overwatch and quick play. I personally think quick play has gotten too sweaty, and I think we should try to figure out ways to alleviate that over time. Whether
It's unqueuable
whether
for
it
me.
be like
It's
even in some of
unqueuable.
the experiments we're doing in the future with how we're want to look at like roll queue and everything, or some other form of it. But it has gotten to the point where, you know, you play a game quick play, maybe flats, and you go in and people are counter swapping you. You're like, oh, this is not the quick play experience you remember or really.
That's kind of the
even
format,
looking
though,
for
forcing
at
that.
point in time. Right.
That's the format forcing that part, though.
I didn't intend to, but on that, I'm going to follow up, which is that, like, how have you found, because you've added a lot of systems which kind of make it sweatier, right? You've added, like, the lever penalties that are really harsh, and, like, you know, the battle pass progress is like, one argument I've heard since the start of Overwatch 2, people said, well, I try so hard in quick play because I need to get certain things for my battle pass. So, like, that's another so, like, you've kind of added these systems. So, like, how are they performing on your end? And if you feel like they're successful, but you don't want quick play to be as sweaty as it is, like, how do you balance that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were too stringent at the beginning of it. We pulled back a little bit on some of those penalties in quick play, but definitely was too harsh when those first went out. I think that's something we're still evaluating. You know, I think we were just talking to Gavin and Morgan yesterday about, you know, what some next steps could be for that, and if they're in the right place currently. There's also, I do think though, there's an element in quick play that you're still playing to win in some way. Yeah. I think
nobody's playing to
lose. Like how hard you're trying to win, but I think if someone is literally, you know, AFK in spawn, or they're not even trying to be with the team, I don't think that's the right way. That's not how we want quick play to evolve.
Alec
Dawson
either, seems so
right?
green to
We
me.
do want to be
What does that
pro.
mean? What does it seem green?
It's like you're
what does that
playing
mean?
With your friends, you're all trying to like have a good time, try to win. You may not like slide tackle each other like and try to like go all out, but you're still trying to have a good time, you know, set up plays.
I'm telling you guys, I like Alec. Like,
that's same sort of thing.
Especially after Juno, like, he kind of just doubled down to me. I think he's done well, to be honest.
Yeah, it's tough.
Awesome.
I mean, there's 11 other players in one of those matches where somebody leaves, and so I think when when people say, hey, this ought to be the more casual mode, they're right. But then at the same time, like,
They should remove
you
lever
are playing
penalties
a
from quick
social
play.
game, you're playing it with other people. And like one of the things that we look at a lot is, or we talk about internally is stomps in the game, you know? And there can be a lot of different reasons for stomps, but they don't feel good when they happen to you. One of the factors is levers in a game, you know? And so it's like, do we want to, like, how much freedom do you give somebody to affect another player's experience in the game? I don't think there's like a perfect answer here. It's probably going to be something that like
There's not.
us and every other like social, especially like competitive game is always going to struggle with, you know, but we are trying to find like that right balance of like, how do you give players freedom, but also how do you like try to restrict them from like harming another player's game experience?
Yeah. And there has been differences there when looking at stomps. Like this, the spawn system that we have in quick play is different than the one in competitive, and we're actually looking at that for season 12 and maybe some improvements there to see like how we can make that even better experience. Hopefully, less stomps in the game as well.
Nice, thank you. That's very illuminating, actually.
It's
Flash,
the
anything you wanna
format
add?
that's causing stomps.
Not on this part now.
It's not the
Okay,
spawns.
cool.
It's
I want
not
to
the
actually skip
spawns.
forward
It's not
a
the
significant
spawns.
chunk, actually, if you're all right with it. I actually want to go into talking about tanks and stuff because I think these guys have alluded to counter swapping. So do you mind if
When
I?
all
Yeah,
the
no,
powers
go
in
ahead,
one
sorry, go
roll.
ahead.
Right. So
And you
because
can't overcome it.
Alec, you kind of mentioned really saliently there that like you're playing quick play and people are still like
Just a
five
more
man counter
volatile
swapping you
format.
and it's very frustrating.
I see what they're trying to do,
So
though.
I think that's partly where this 6v6 movement has come from, right? Like people have said, like, look, tank feels maybe worse than ever to play. And it kind of feels like, and certainly the argument on the 6v6 side is that counter swapping is built into the one tank format. Like you have one tank, there will always be counter swapping, and that always will create misery. So is that how you guys view it? Like, do you think that counter swapping will always be a thing in Overwatch 2? Or do you find like there's maybe
They
some
should
way
remove
we
the retaining
can
ult charge.
alleviate
They
it?
should remove
and do you
that. That
agree
would
with the
help.
assessment that like people are like, this sucks. Like this as a format, this sucks. People swapping me all the time.
Let's see if the goalpost
Yeah,
is
I
moved.
think there's a few things here, right? First off,
This will be very interesting.
what we see, like actually how players behave, is so DPS damage players and tank players swap about the same rate, right? They usually swap. You see on average like one a match, and then support players are about half of that, so they swap a lot less. And I think the experience of tank, you're kind of the one being targeted in this, right? It's not just that the tank swapping for you; it's also that the DPS swaps for you too. And I think everyone's talked about whether in some ranks where it might feel like Reaper, they get a Reaper swap into them. They're like, oh man, I have to deal with Reaper. That part can definitely be frustrating. I think there's ways we want to look at alleviating that. I think we want to look at some of those like more hard counters still. Make those a little bit softer. That's something that's on our mind. But also I think it's important for us to kind of have a conversation about that is a core part of the game. It's a core mechanic of Overwatch, and they're actually not necessarily like counter swapping to skill, but understanding team composition and how those go against each other. That's a game knowledge check to some degree as you move up, right? And we believe like that flexibility is really important in the game. We would never want to lock people, into hero roles, into a hero choice for the whole game.
We're
I
beating
just
around the
don't
bush
think that's
right now.
what Overwatch is, or what Overwatch is.
The issue is not that it's
necessarily
there; it's how
about.
much it rewards you without actually executing. That's the
We've
issue.
tried some things internally. We looked at like limited swaps. We looked at maybe you have to earn your swaps.
No,
We've definitely gone through some experiments. I think we're still chatting about that right now.
Don't do it.
It's
Don't.
probably it's kind of crept its way up the list of things that are at top of mind for the team, and like maybe some solutions that we might need to look at. Because we understand that it is a frustrating experience, but also I think it's important to continue the conversation of what are the extreme examples. And for us, when we talk about the hard counters and versus soft counters, we need to kind of identify some of those that feel really bad because it's map dependent, it's hero dependent, right? Just because they swap into Zarya and you're D.Va and you suddenly can't block the beam doesn't mean necessarily like a finished match. It's really depending on like how much verticality is available to you.
Yeah, but it's not fun.
Style? There's a lot of things you.
But it's not fun.
You have tools at your disposal to deal with that, and we need to provide tanks with, more of those tools in certain situations as well.
So you have to generalize every character. That's not.
I think.
Come on, man.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Come on, that's
No,
not that's not an answer.
Okay.
We're here to talk. We're here to listen to you talk. So
That's
go
not
ahead.
an answer.
I think it's interesting too when you you look at like the broad or even like the broader Overwatch community where like
Smart.
there's different parts of the community
They're not
bring
ready
up
to answer it yet. I get it.
counter swapping tank play in 6v6, I think more than other parts of the community. And what we see is some of this is actually even region specific, you know, so it's
I
like
believe that 100%.
you might like it is something that we hear about a lot, especially like on like North American creators and stuff, but like some of like the other regions, they have kind of a different take on it.
Asia does their own thing.
Sometimes, you know, like let's say we're talking like to our Korean players where they might be like, can you please stop talking about this? You know, like, can you please stop talking about 6v6 and just get on with 5v5 because that's what we want to do. So it's like there is like I think what we want to like, one of the things we would like players to know is that we totally get the feedback, and like what Alec is saying is we do actually think that there's some things we can do to address it in the world of 5v5. But we're also trying to listen to like all of our players like worldwide at the same time.
They can take the ult charge retention out altogether. That's an easy thing.
As I said, it's more top of mind, so we're taking a closer look at it recently. And what we see is swapping in matches actually happens the most like in Plat and Diamond compared to other ranks. Whether that be, you know, higher ranks are consolidating on the meta faster, or whether they're more one tricks in that area, and then bronze players just don't do it as much too. It's kind of like has this, you know, little parabola there.
Right. There's lots of really interesting things. Flats, anything you wanna?
Total non-answers there.
I want to lead into one of my questions, then, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, I just want to say this. Dodge the question beautifully, in a way. So the issue with counter swapping is not that it's a fundamental part of Overwatch. It's that when you've made these tanks giga tanks, like, you get rewarded way more just for making the right swap than actually making a play. And so this game is supposed to be more on the competitive side about execution. The execution factor has been drastically minimalized here, to the point where, like, when I was playing Orisa, like, unranked to GM, and their Diamond Zarya swapped to Zarya, I couldn't make a play on him. There's no window of vulnerability to make a play because that tank has giga stats. And so, like, again, there's only so far you can go in 5v5 to address this, but I'll let them keep going.
You compact into them, and I feel like that's a lot of the argument around the 66 is like, you know, once you put it on two people, it's a lot harder to, you know, focus on one person because that attention is spread out, that responsibility is spread out because you get so much value from it. But I just kind of want to know, like, what does the team think, and like if this also kind of almost comes back to the first question of the interview is, we don't decide to do it, how do you bring excitement back to the game? Because 6v6 is potentially a nice thing sitting on the table. If we decide to go forward with 5v5 we are today,
I mean, why are they locked in? They're not locked into one format either. They could do 5v5 in some seasons.
Yeah, I could go ahead. I can start on that. And I think you're right that regardless of whether we would move forward or like permanently swap to a 6v6 format, just running it would be something that would be pretty exciting for the community. You know, like we totally get that. But like I think it's also like there's like a few things maybe to talk about in the question, because I might not agree with like all of the setup there. Like there's like probably a pretty broad set of like definitions of what a casual game is, you know?
Yeah.
And so like, you know, I mentioned like Mario Party very early on, like that's a pretty casual game, you know? It's hard to put Overwatch in the same category as a game like that, you know? So I'd probably push back on that a little bit. Like the kind of like the mastery curve of maybe like any one hero in our game is pretty long. And like the mastery curve of like getting to where you feel like you could be good at Overwatch is pretty huge also. It takes a pretty big time investment to get into this game. And it's actually something that we talk about sometimes as being a problem and like a big obstacle for new players getting into our game, because there's just
I was gonna say
so much you have to learn and be able to sort of like execute on. And then like
compared to
I
COD,
think the other thing to remember is like we've got like millions of players every day logging in to Overwatch, and like when we look at our own like internal metrics on it, like the game, it feels like it's pretty sticky for a lot of these players. There's like a lot of people that feel like that they're enjoying this game and continuing, you know, and like in like their like in their interaction of it. And so like I think that like from our point of view, it's like, yeah, I think like we acknowledge the feedback and that there's things to be doing with tanks. And I don't think it's just counter swapping. Like the thing we haven't talked about yet also is like the pressure put on that tank player as well, you know? So like I think that there's things to do there. Especially in the world of 5v5, like in the world where there's five
Don't
five
say
players on
4v4.
each team. I think we've got levers that we can pull. And we also did talk about like potentially there could be other game formats that work in 5v5 as well, like maybe different ways of putting a team composition together that are a little bit more of like a hybrid version of a role queue system, you know? So and maybe like I don't know if I had to get into
That'd
this,
be
like maybe
really
I'm going a little
interesting.
too far here, but like I know a lot of people talk about that, like the mythical, you know, October balance patch, right? Where it's like, hey, here's where like 6v6 was in the very best state that it was, you know, to where it's like if you never had that for Overwatch 1, would people still kind of be in this same headspace? Is there a version of balance in Overwatch 2 that achieves those same goals?
No,
Yeah,
there's not.
would second a lot of that. I think there's still like a really strong foundation. I think our content is getting better and better, actually. I think even if we look at like Juno's coming to season 12, I think our hero releases have gotten more defined in terms of what Overwatch 2 heroes are compared to what may have been in the past. So very
Good
excited
job
about
on
that.
Juno.
I think there's
But no, there's
Hyper
not.
changes I'm excited about coming to the next patch. Things of that nature that
I wanna
we're looking
finish.
at kits and being able to actually make them better and better. So I think there's constant improvement happening. You know, map reworks coming in season 13, right? So that we've
Just
spoken
because of
about
how
as well.
tanks function.
So I think
If they're gonna
evaluating
have their
all
unique
that, I think there's really
identities.
still a very strong foundation, but we need
Like
to make
5v5
a lot of
has
elements in
limited
the game
hero
more
identity.
rewarding. You know, make sure that there's times you come back to play Overwatch because there's something going
The
on
big
that's
combos,
very
the peak
special.
moments, that's
and
what
I
made
think
that
there's a
patch
few of
special.
those, like coming up, but also making sure like there's offerings for every type of player. I think right now there's a very core experience, but we need to make sure we
'Cause
put a
it's
little
the gameplay
effort
loop,
into
too.
things maybe above
Like the gameplay loop in 6v6 was like 3 to 4 times more dynamic than it is in 5v5.
very similar comp and quick play to some degree.
They can make the best
So,
patch in 5v5
I think
ever,
there's still a very
and it wouldn't change that gameplay
we're working
loop.
with a really good base here. Overwatch is still, you know, I think an amazing game, but there's work to do for sure. And I think as long as we continue to improve it, I think we can end up
Like
in a good
5v5,
place.
it could be good,
Can I ask you a question just
but
on like
it
what
will
you said?
never be better. It can't.
You say like
it can't
the
replicate
content
that.
is like, you know, like is improved. I'm curious on like what aspect you mean, just because we had a podcast recently, we talked about it, and like even at the beginning of this we talked a little bit about like, you know, there's got to be something more to that cadence. What
Sure,
like
yeah.
what things would you say like are you guys most proud of those additions, or like what do you think are the ones that move the needle the most?
Well, I think there's been a lot of learnings. You know, even if you look at some of like a clear example to me is kind of this is smaller in terms of the needle, right? But let me just go for it. Like if you look at Runasapi coming out, where it's like that takes a lot of learnings from Push and the first few maps of Push, and then I think that's
But
I think it's the
Runasapi's
best
alright. I
designed
actually
map
don't
for
mind
Push, right?
Runasapi.
And that's because we've learned things from when we released the mode. And I think you look at Heroes, you look at Juno, and we look
Juno's
at
great.
Some of, you know,
Juno's
some
great.
of the polish that's gone into there. You know, there's a lot of people on the team, including myself, that haven't been around for a very long time, right? And I think all of these people
Juno's
have gotten
great.
better and better over time. So we're
Ju-
making
Ju-
better stuff and
dude.
we're making it faster. So that part of it was like seeing how the team works together on the day to
Dude,
day.
Alec
and
did a
being
better
more
job on
focused and
Juno
getting
than
better
Jeff
at our
Goodman did
jobs.
for
I
6
think
years.
that's, you know,
So
helped a lot with some of the content we've released.
I think that there's a bit more there too. So, like the say what you want to say about the competitive system that launched with Overwatch 2. But
Terrible.
I think that like season 9 was like a really big step forward for the ranked
Systems.
system in the
Yeah.
game. I also think that like
Patch sucked,
when you
but
start looking at
in hindsight.
a lot of the events that we used to run compared to some of the ones that we're getting into now. So something like Mirror Watch, something like the latest quick play hacks with pickable passives, even things like the April Fool's events that we run. We feel like there's really something about kind of like changing the way that our heroes play on a like a core fundamental level that our players like that really resonates with the player base. And so I think that like when we start talking about like content coming forward, whether it's for events or things for the core game, I think that we start looking at the response that we've gotten from players to events like that. Like Alex said, I think that there's like a lot of learnings that we've had, and it's taken us a little while to get to this point where we're like, oh hey, here's what it feels like our players like really want to play these types of events, get the most people playing in them, playing the most hours for the longest period of time. And so we think that like, and you'll see it in upcoming events that we're going to be doing, you know, in upcoming seasons through the rest of this year and next year. I think you're going to see a lot more of that.
Yeah, I think like April Fools is one of these moments. April Fools, the 2023, right? Last year's one, where like we're like, oh, this is really resonating, and that was sort of where we started to sort of shift a little bit about, you know, and now we're at this place of like, okay, these are the types of events we want to build, and this makes everything more focused, and we feel like it hits better with the community as well.
Yeah, and
in
it's
terms
not
of these PvP things. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, it's not just events. It's like,
Yeah.
how do we start pulling this stuff into the game?
Yeah, kind of everywhere, but that's like a isolated example of something,
Yeah.
right?
Nice. Flats, here's what I'm thinking we do, because we've got about 15 minutes of their time left. I have
Oh, man.
one follow-up question.
Wait, is
on
that
this
it?
stuff.
No, I think we have longer.
No.
We're supposed to have an hour, right?
Hour and a
Or
half.
do you guys have more? Hour and a half? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We have more? Okay, well, that's great. If you have more of your time, then we don't have to kind of rush through.
I'm
But
sorry,
in
guys.
that
I
case, have a
actually like
follow-up on
Alec.
this
I really
department,
do.
Flats, and then we can maybe start moving over towards like 6v6 kind of stuff.
Alec
I
is
know
my
that the
beacon of hope for
6v6
this
people will
game.
be very unhappy with us if we have this time with you guys and we don't kind of interrogate a little bit. But since while you are talking about like all this big picture stuff, I'm just kind of curious. You mentioned, Alec, you were like, okay, map vetoes are on the line, hero bans are on the line. Like, how big? And even Aaron mentioned as well that you're looking at like just big changes, like something that might even change up the format, the open queue.
Mhm.
How big are we talking? Like, how big is the window of where you could go? Like, what can we see? Are we going to see like items? You know, like a MOBA item system? Are we going to see like some sort of talent system? You know, that's what the pickable passes alludes to. Like, how big is the table when it comes to you guys talking about it, and how serious are those discussions of like, yeah, we could actually go down this route of adding items to Overwatch, for example?
Yeah, I mean, we have conversations about these things. We have been testing some of these things, but I think what leads the conversation is it has to improve the core experience of Overwatch, you know, long term. It can't just be a short term, like, oh, this is nice, and then you're like a month later, like, actually, this needs to be removed, you know, from the game entirely. That's why sometimes you see some of those things sort of come through quick play hacks, because they're experiments that give us a little bit of we gather some feedback. We actually have in-game surveys now that go out to players too, and get feedback from them as well. So when you see something like pickable passives, we're not necessarily trying that exact system. We're experimenting with the UI of this. We're experimenting with being able to make a choice in the game and how players actually feel about that.
Alec
Do they
hasn't
change
cared about
strategy?
improving the
But
experience
it's not
of
necessarily
Overwatch
on
for
the
years.
individual ones. Like,
Dude, he
we've talked
just
about here specific
came
ones
to
and what that may
Overwatch
be and
like
how
a
that
year
would
and a half
work and
ago.
whether that is good for long-term health. And that's something we've tested recently.
What
So
do you mean
there's
he
a
hasn't cared
bunch
for
of
years? He
different
just got here.
things we're trying out, I would say.
What?
But at the end of the day, they have to make the core Overwatch experience better. And there's a lot of things about that experience that people love because of how approachable it is and how clean it is. So if we did something like items, it would have to make the game better
how
for hundreds
simple
of
it
hours,
is,
right?
but deep at the same
I'm having a
time.
hard time
At least that's what was
like
beautiful about Overwatch
answering
1.
the question without getting into too many specifics, because I don't really want to like give away everything that we're doing. But I think that like maybe from like the high level big picture perspective it's like I think that's like a fair ask from the community, and it's something that we agree with, the way that you frame this question of like what are some of the bigger things that you can be doing to the game besides just adding additional content to it. So we like it's too early to talk about some of those. You'll start seeing some things coming later this year that'll probably, like kind of like give people hints and point to different systems that can be coming. Um, but like big picture is like, yeah, like I think we're like mostly on the same page here, with a like a valid maybe not critique, but a valid direction for where to take Overwatch.
Do you have like a little crumb you want to drop us, Aaron? Like a little like, oh, I really, like this concept. Like it really kind of piques my interest.
Keep trying,
No,
SVB.
'cause
He's
I'll
not
just
biting.
end up, what I'll do is I'll probably do the whole thing and I'll get in trouble. So
He heard me
we don't-
first, and he probably thought I said too much. So
We don't want to get anyone in trouble here. Okay.
my
Flats, you have
very
anything you wanna
first
follow up?
interview on
Yep.
the Overwatch team, we brought some creators in, and the one thing we weren't going to talk to them about, this is way before the game shipped, was that we were going to have cosmetics in the game. And like, why is that a thing you're not supposed to talk about? But whatever. And I was answering a question, and I just like, I don't know why I got to that point, and I just started. I'm just like people could see me start to say skins, and I said it, and it took me like 10 seconds to say the word. And I'm like this runaway train of like, you're not supposed to say this, and I just
I
just
feel
did
that,
it
man.
anyway, so
couldn't
I
help
feel
it.
that.
yeah,
You get excited. I get it.
It must be hard. Like it must be so hard having so many, like a million things, and also keeping track of like what you've made public and what you've not made public. I sympathize.
It's like hard to even play the game sometimes. Like I remember before like Overwatch 2 shipped, and you're like playing Reinhardt trying to stop your charge, because all you're doing at work during the day is playing with Reinhardt that gets to cancel his charge. And it's just like sometimes you just like can't keep it in your head of like what's live, what's coming this season, what's coming the next season, and it's like it's pretty awkward.
I can imagine. Flash, you have any follow-ups on this section, or should we move on?
I feel like we should move on. I think you should do the first question on the 6v6. I think that's a good one, right? Up to you.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I'm down to. And then I know Flats has quite a few follow-ups on the 6v6, which I'm eager for you guys to answer Flats' questions. So I'll start us off on the 6v6 section, which is just that, do you get where the frustration comes from? Like, do you get the pain points? Because I think a lot of it, especially, comes from tanking. But do you get why people are seeking the 6v6 solution? Why they feel like we'll never solve the tank solution? Why we need the 2 tank synergy? Why it balances the game out? Why it kind of gives this higher skill ceiling? Like, do you get
It's a better
where they come
foundation
from?
for them to build a game on.
it's a different experience to some degree, right? I think Aaron mentioned it. The pressure of that experience, the responsibility of that experience, is way heightened in Overwatch 2 compared to Overwatch 1, and that's something that's a lot of tank players may not enjoy. I feel like, especially if you're playing off tank. and then
Ask
you
about
come to
Q
Overwatch
rates.
2, that's a different experience kind of in itself too. You're playing your hero that used to be able to take a lot more flanks and routes, and now your team's yelling at you maybe in chat, right? So, and if you look at the way we've designed tanks, we've tried to give some of them a little bit ways to let their team feel their presence more too, right? I think when you take the recent Wrecking Ball change, adaptive shields, it's supposed to be like a little thing Wrecking Ball can use from time to time that his team can appreciate Wrecking Ball's presence, right? And he's able to actually maybe help them from time to time too. It's not necessarily the main way Wrecking Ball is playing, but something there. So I think having a tank on your team leading the charge, a lot of players are kind of looking for that. And if you're playing a different role than that, then it kind of creates a lot of friction. And you get targeted more. Too.
And it's not
so
perfect,
we understand
but-
that solo tank has a lot more responsibility, a lot more pressure, and we've played variants of 6v6 where that does feel less, right? If you have someone that can cover for you, they can also cover for some of your allies to peel more too. Because I think right now at the moment there are a lot of times where if your team's not coordinated or you're not on comms and maybe there are players that you're not familiar with, it feels like they're asking you to do one thing, but someone's asking you to do something else, and you can't be in 2 places at once all the time, right? So, but previously you had someone that could cover for you. I think we get that fundamentally, yeah.
I do want to push really quick back a little.
Let's do it.
I think it's genuinely hit the point where it's unhealthy. Where the average
Which part in particular?
about how much responsibility is on that role and how much pressure there is.
Because they've
on
had
that
to
role,
buff the role
that
more
not
and
even
more and
high
more.
level- not even just high level players, but the average player legitimately cannot handle how much pressure is put on it between, you know, in your medal ranks,
And
everybody
apparently they've
wants a
seen Q
shield.
rates
or
go down.
wants
I
someone
want them to
stand
ask
there.
about Q
They
rates.
want
What
peel.
are the Q rates
They want
right
people
now?
to be aggressive. They want you to get kills. They want you to have more damage than the other tank. They want you to have more pressure than the other tank. They want you to be counter swapping. If you're not counter swapping their tank, you're throwing. If they counter swap you, you need to either counter swap them back or have your team counter swap them, but they might not want to.
And how much is that?
It
a
has
player
gotten to the
psychology,
point
though,
where
too?
it's like
Well, I guess it
not
all
even
is
just
psychology.
balance wise, because like I think a lot of people, myself included, overreacted to the balance patch that came out
Nope.
and thought it was pushing the tank balance way too far,
did.
the power meter. But it feels decent, like it feels good. But it's like it's so
Have
far
you
over
played
to the
Devo
side,
Flats?
and it's like I have a feeling we're gonna have to pull it back. That even pushing it that far out, it still feels like you're
What?
sometimes 1v5.
Have you played
or
against Devo?
You're 1v9 because you're fighting your 4 teammates. I not even just saying 6v6 is like the answer, but like that
Hard
pressure
disagree.
is so immense that I don't even know if it's sustainable.
Yeah, there's a lot of social friction, and that's something we talk about a lot. You know, are there
Diva's
ways we could just better
unkillable.
educate the player base as a whole, where they have a role too in the way the team is composed, right? Like your support players can also switch and they can also do these things. They can also play in different positions. But you're correct, Flats. I do think they expect. Your
Like my
teammates
Diva was
expect you to do
25 and 0
kind of everything
today.
a lot of the time. Yeah.
Actually, quick follow up on that as well. That like, on that note, as Flats mentioned, when the patch came out, I saw a lot of the community kind of react strongly to be like, "Oh my god, they've giga buff tanks. Like this is gonna
They
be
did!
awful." I think another consequence of what's happened, I see this shift a lot more in Overwatch 2 than I did in Overwatch 1. It feels like each of the roles are at opposition with each other. Like it feels like when, you know, at the start of Overwatch 2, we had like, oh, supports don't have enough and we needed to fix supports. Then for a while it was like we need to get DPS more stuff, and then it was like when they get the DPS passes.
Asymmetrical
Now we're
format.
back to like, well, tanks need more stuff. Like, is it always going to be this way? Are we always going to have
Yes,
like the
you
roles kind
have
of at war
an
with each other? Like someone is
unbalanceable
losing, and
format.
it's like a zero-sum game. Like someone
One
is
role has
losing for
one
someone
player,
else to win.
and the others have
Like,
two.
does it always have to be this way, or do you guys feel like you do have ideas for how to solve
It's too
that?
hard to do. It's
that
so
constant
hard to
friction
get that right.
between the roles.
It's so hard to do that in this format. It's
I
impossible.
think it's a matter of how far apart that is at any given time. You know,
Fair.
Depending on if it's closer together. I think at the moment you look at it, tanks definitely. Well, tanks have always had the most influence on a match throughout Overwatch 2's history. Whether that experience felt good or not is you know, subjective opinion, right? But they've always had the most influence on how a match results. But at the moment, they definitely have a lot of the power as well in that dynamic. So I think, yeah, are they pushed a little far? Maybe, yes. And that was, you know, somewhat intentional, trying to find, you know, where would it kind of shake the core of the game a little bit too far. But we wanted to make sure that tanks were more resilient. I think what we saw in season 9, everyone dies more post season 9, right, for the amount of damage they take. But tanks had the biggest drop in what we would call tankiness there compared to any other role. You know,
Dude,
let's say,
everything
like,
feels
it was
unkillable.
almost double some of the other roles in terms of like how much damage they were taking for how much they were dying. So we wanted to kind of even that out a little bit.
It feels
make
like
them more
things
resilient, make them
die
feel like they can
less.
actually make plays with,
I don't know.
you know, be able to step forward without, you know, blowing up. So right now, I mean, we're still evaluating it, but I think it's just a matter of how far apart those roles are. I think one role might be a little bit better than another role at any given time, or that's where the conversation may go. But if they're too far apart, that's when I think when we should probably, you know, take a look at bringing them back in a little bit.
I mean, they might have stats on that, J Money, but it doesn't feel
Sure
like
thing.
that.
Okay. Flats. I'm going to take it over to you on some 6 questions.
Sure. I'm going to combine 2 questions into one to hopefully save some time. In the blog, it seemed like there was some hardware constraints with Overwatch 2 being a bigger game and a heavier game overall. Could the game even switch to handle 6v6? And if it did switch, is there a rough estimate on how long it would even take to, like, how much work would it take to switch the game from 5v5 to 6v6 if the test decided that
Switch players can
this
keep
was a better
5v5 for their
format for the
Overwatch mobile. How about that?
Yeah, that's there's maybe like a little bit of context for that, because I think the answer is going to be it depends, you know. Maybe not on the amount of work, but maybe on the amount of time it could
Because this could
take
be
to
on
do
the
something like
Nintendo
that.
releasing
So,
a new Switch
yeah, there
as
are
well.
some performance issues on some older systems with it that we would need to take care of. It's interesting, like when you look at different games and game engines and what they're like sort of like built for, is that Like you typically are going to build your engine based off of the game you're running. So, you know, like the Overwatch 2 engine is very optimized for a 5v5 game format, you know? And we do allow people to play 6v6 in custom game, but it's not really optimized for that. We've put all of our optimizations into running like the main part of the game. It's kind of similar to where it's like, I don't know exactly what engine, like let's say like Street Fighter uses, but you probably can't just suddenly start running a battle royale, you know, in the Street Fighter engine. It's just not built for that, right? So ours kind of has like some constraints there, and I think that like there'd be work that we would need to do, and the timeline would probably depend on kind of like the results from some of these tests that we were to run. So like let's say we were to run some 6v6 tests and the community wasn't really that excited for it, or it was a very split thing. We would probably continue to put work into it, but maybe not at the same pace as the version where it's like, hey, we put out a 6v6 test, like everybody's just flocking to that. Like you see like the popularity of it to where it's like, okay, we're going to have to start dropping other initiatives across the team in
When
order
they
to
test
like
this shit, you all better
actually
log
give,
on. That's
like,
all I'm
actually
saying.
turn the game into the thing that we
I will
think
be
is the
playing
best
tank
version of it and
all
what players are like
Day.
unanimously asking for, right? So I think in that world there is sort of like an all hands on deck moment where you're like, oh man, we've really got to do this, you know? Like I think that right now we are like in an investigatory, is that a real word? We are in a period where we are investigating.
Do I have to make
like,
a
kind of
6v6
like
propaganda
the total
video, boys?
sum of what
Like a
that
6v6
work
hype
would
video?
be.
Of people being like, it's
But
never
so,
coming
like,
back.
there's a range, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, where it's something that would be probably
I don't want to
several
vilify
seasons to
people
much
by doing
longer,
that, is the thing.
depending on, you know, like reaction
we need
from
to
the
get people on the
community
game.
based off of any of the tests we want to run.
Yeah, and we look at sort of the gameplay side of it. I think it's, you know, there's definitely a lot of effort in balancing that mode compared to 5v5 and making that shift, but a lot of that is subtraction rather than addition. You know, I think we look at
CCP style.
some
I'm
of
gonna
the
have to
reworks that
pass
happened
on
over
that.
time. I think we look at sort of what
have to pass
tanks
on
are
that.
able
Sorry,
to do
buddy.
right now.
That's a little.
And we're not adding a ton of new abilities.
Christ.
I think if anything, it's
No.
looking at what don't some of these heroes need. And we'd be taking a visual pass in terms of clutter, and can we kind of redistribute some of that as well?
You know what, let's get rid of Immortality
We know once
Field.
you add 2 more players, it's going to get more and more crowded in the game too. So I don't think the effort there is, you know, this giant thing that would take us a very, very long time. We want to be able to make sure if it was the best choice, we'd be able to be relatively responsive there.
You're Overwatch punching air right now.
Yeah.
Frito doesn't
Zach,
really
you wanna keep
care
going?
about either one.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound like, you know, obviously it depends on community reaction, and I highly doubt
he just said
that
what he
everyone
thought.
will be united on one side. As much as everyone likes to think they will be, I'm sure there's a large silent majority of, you know, and I don't like it, but casual side. I think of casual gamers as the TikTok gamers. That's how I think of them. They don't really like watch YouTube. They don't watch streamers. They don't do anything. They just like get a random TikTok at the beginning of the season that tells them all the changes, and they go, "Oh, what's all the skins?" And that's it. And that's like their Overwatch interaction. But it sounds like it would be a pretty long time. But I guess at that point, like, you know, if it's a couple seasons to sounding like potentially years or a year or more, if it was even like a hell yeah, like let's go in, would that even be counting heroes that potentially need reworks? Because I couldn't see like Malga working, you know,
Cap,
like or
Cap,
you know,
Cap,
even heroes
Cap,
that I think are
Cap.
great, like Junker Queen, like probably need
Nope.
some tuning or some changes, maybe
Balance
even.
patch. All they
Would
need.
that be included in that estimate, or is that a completely different, like,
That is one patch.
that's just so the game can run, never mind
One
all
patch.
the hero adjustments
Don't
that
need
would probably
reworks.
be needed
Myth.
on top of it?
Myth.
Those are like different parts of the team, and things like that can all
Myth.
kind of like work concurrently if
Myth.
we want them to. You know, like anything that you do
6v6
on a
code proves
game
this
team, it's not, you don't have
immediately.
infinite resources. You have like a certain size of the team, so the more hero design resources you potentially put into reworks could theoretically slow down.
Don't need to
other
rework any of
hero
them.
rework
Number
or
changes.
other hero work that's happening. It's not, that's not going to be the big lift here, though. You know, like it really is kind of like looking at some of the performance considerations. I think that that's going to be more
And,
substantial.
and
work
Aaron
than-
debunked
than
it either
the other
way.
sides of it.
So
And
we're good.
they're like, and Alec can talk to this better than I can, but there are a lot of things to look at, you know, like one of the things that we talked about the other day is just like, hey, in the world of 6v6, suddenly does Winston lose his alternate fire? You know,
Nope.
it's like
Those
probably
changes,
not.
those
It's just
changes
like
didn't matter. They
man, it'd
didn't
be
matter
really
at
hard
all.
to take that away, and it's a lot of fun to use. But there are definitely a lot of things we would need to look at, mostly in the tank role, you know, in that world.
Right click
in that
can stay.
world,
Ryan pin cancel can stay.
that we're kind of theoretically talking about right now is also accepting queue times, right? Rather than having a plan for how to actually go about trying to make those better too. I think some of the experiments we're going to run are targeted at maybe making those things better, making queue times better. But if we end up, you know, theoretically, if it goes to roll queue 6v6, we kind of know that's a problem already.
Roll lock.
There needs to be something there that can, you know, help alleviate that over time too.
Is there any early ideas on how to fight those queue times?
So I think that there's maybe like a few things we could talk about. One thing we hear a lot from the community is just like make tanks more fun, you know? And maybe there's a bit of that we can do. I actually think that there's some of that we can do. Like if you look at how far do I roll this back? If you look at the graph, the queue time graph that we showed in the blog, you know, it's a very simple bar graph. The original graph that we were going to show is more of like an over time sort of like line graph, kind of like showing the queue times for different roles over Overwatch history. But we kind of wanted to put out the most simple one we could, just so that like everybody could look at it and understand what we were talking about. But one of the things that you can see is that there was a pretty substantial change in support queue times after Overwatch 2 launched, and like the role was in a worse spot than, you know, like the supports were really getting picked on. I think that there was like a lot of complaints from the community, and we put a lot of effort into supports to where now they're no, like for a little while they were the bottleneck, you know, like right after Overwatch 2 launched, and they're nowhere near that point right now. And so I think that we have a story of us being able to look at a whole role and making it more appealing and more popular to players. So I think we could do some of that for tanks. But I mean, I've listened to some of you talk about this, and I think we're probably all in agreement that I don't think you ever get to make like tank as popular as DPS in like a game, you know? So it's like we could shift it and mitigate it a bit, but that would need to be something that I think we would be looking at in that world. And then I think
thought it
some of
wasn't
the other
doable.
things that we would talk about doing is coming up with a less restrictive like way of queuing into the game, you know, like that'd probably be where some of our initial experiments would run.
And that could
And
be
I get
interesting.
that is something that could happen in 5v5 also. Like this, it is
Sure,
it
absolutely,
is
it could.
a different topic to where
It
yes,
could.
that you
It
could do
could.
something like that in 6v6.
It
You could
could.
do something
It
like
could.
that in 5v5.
It could.
But we would look at something like that in 6v6 too. And then there is a question, and like I wouldn't.
Why does
want
Alec
this
need to
be
get
the
fired? What
answer,
kind of
but
dumb
like I
comment
think
is that? What do
as
you mean?
like as a team,
He's
we
done a
have to
good
be
job.
open to like any sort of reality
silly
that
comment.
makes the game better. Like there is a world where like people want a certain format that they're willing to put up with longer queue times to have it, and that's just the game that they want, you know? So it's like some people might actually want that and prefer it, you know? So like we are like kind of like open to a lot of different possibilities. I think the one thing we haven't talked about here too is
They
just
have
like
to buff tanks in the format. He didn't
in
choose the
that world
format.
is whether
He's a hero designer.
whether
He's not
we
the lead
actually
balancer.
run two
don't even
different
have the right guy.
formats of Overwatch next to each other simultaneously. I think that like it's easy to say like that we think that there's a lot of work there, there's a lot of pitfalls there, but
It's silly.
if you have like players like seriously asking for things, and there's like you can see the game, let's say, growing at a faster rate, or a bunch of people jumping in and really responding to something, why wouldn't you want to shift the way you run your game
So yeah,
in order for
Mauga
one,
had to be made
for,
the way that
like,
he was
players to enjoy it
to
more,
fit in
and
this
two,
format.
for you to be more successful, for the game to be more successful. You know, like, so I think that there's a lot of openings there, and maybe I didn't. Now that I'm thinking about my answer, I don't know if I totally answered your question there.
No, you're fine.
So, like, okay.
Watch,
I,
I get,
uh,
all good
they
information.
can
There's a few things on
drastically
the tank
mitigate
one
queue
in particular.
times.
We actually saw with the midseason patch, players, like, we want to look at this long term though, but players are not queuing for tank more, and they're queuing for damage and tank more than they were previously. And we have seen queue time gains with that patch, and has sustained itself too. And it's not the percentage, I think that we talk about being like the holy grail, but I think that's a recent example of something. Okay, the experience has been powered up a little bit, or brought up a little bit, and here are the results of that too. So I think long term we may have to change some of our hero cadence strategy if we ever end up in a different format, right? In terms of, there needs to be more options and more types of play experiences for tank players in particular, if that is the case long term.
SUB, I want to rip it.
May-
I don't want to take
may
away
take
any of
five.
your
Go for
time.
it.
I want to rip it. Aaron, you kind of led me
Go for it,
into
go
it.
for it.
I have to ask you this
Yeah, do it.
question. Have you ever considered 7v7? And if so, could it even be feasibly done?
So not that seriously. A lot of our, like, we did some really early play tests in Overwatch development of 7v7. And it's funny, like I did say earlier that, like, the right decisions could change over time. So, like, hey, maybe that's something you revisit, right? But at the time, a lot of the feedback that we would get from those play tests is it just felt like you were being attacked from everywhere at the same time. There's just, like, enough players in the match that it happened. And I think that, like, I think what can happen sometimes is when there's one too many things, like, the difference between having one too many things to track and 10 too many things to track can almost feel the same to a lot of players, like, you're just overloaded, and it's funny, like, even in a lot of our, like, level design, when we're working on maps, some of the last things you do is, like, you might close, like, one window or one door, and you get that same shift in feedback from, like, man, I just feel like I'm getting shot from everywhere, to, like, oh, I kind of understand what's happening in this map, and so that's kind of what happened in the early 7v7 play tests. I have a feeling we would get more of that. Like, I would think that we'd probably get some feedback like that if we were to do it again. I'm also not sure if it's, like, the
Sounds like
solution
Mr.
to the queue
Garrison.
time issue. I think it would help it, like, and I'm assuming in that 7v7 you're talking about, like, a 2-3-2, but man, you have way less tanks queuing than support, right now. So you're still going to have, like, an imbalance in the ratios between roles. And so, like, I think, like, mathematically it'd probably help a little bit. But I don't think that it would be the thing that suddenly gets us back to, like, really fast queue times with 2 tanks in there. Maybe, like, maybe I, like, kind of, like, talk about this here also, because like, one of the things that that 5v5 does is it really helped with queue times, right? And we didn't talk about that much, if at all, when we made the swap, right, to Overwatch 2, and we did this. And like, it was like, internally we discussed queue times as a big problem, like, in Overwatch, it was something we really wanted to fix. Like, a lot of people aren't going to wait that long, right? It's just, like, it is a long time to not be playing the game. But one of the things that we were actually never really able to get at before Overwatch 2 was what the real demand was to play DPS. Because every time we did something to, like, shorten the queue, like, whether it was, like, the priority pass system or any of the other things we do, as queue times would go down, you just see other people going and play DPS. Like, there was always, like, this, like, sort of, like, undiscovered set of demand. And so, like, we weren't sure when we did this whether, like, if queue time suddenly went down, if you would just get a ton more people queuing for DPS and for it to not actually affect queue times. Thankfully that like wasn't the case, you know. Shoot, and I don't even know how I got onto that tangent, so I'm just gonna like slowly trail off on that answer, and we can move on.
Well, you were talking about 2-3-2. I think that's why you were saying, because you were saying, well,
Oh,
we're
yeah,
still
there
gonna
you
need a
go.
lot more tank
77,
players.
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, we're still gonna need more tank players. I mean,
Do you want
yeah,
77 flats? I know you've talked about it. I just didn't know how serious you were as you've been talking about it.
I mean, it's not the big thing was like the 2 tanks, right? Like people want 2 tanks, they want to have the synergy, they miss the synergy, or they just want it to so it's
They
like
want
you
lower
can't play in
stats.
one role, right? Like you can't just be like it's only one of you.
We
You're
want
the problem,
dynamic
right? So
playmaking.
a lot of people want 2 tanks,
want-
especially tank players. I think
It's not that
personally
it's 2
from the people I've
tanks.
seen who say they want 6v6 are typically tank players. That is
Yeah.
the majority of people that I believe who want 6v6.
That's not the
That
whole
would give
picture.
them what they want.
A lot of DPS
Q
players
times
want
is
it
a
too
big
because
bottleneck on the
targets are
DPS role,
killable.
and people want to play DPS in every game. It's always the most played. So like by
Right.
giving it an extra role, my idea was like when we went from 6v6 to 5v5, a lot of people believed that the game would be too open, like it would feel empty, it wouldn't feel like as full as it did before, but it didn't. It actually felt okay. My thought process is if I felt that way before, because the game's also evolved, right? Like the game's changed a lot over the years. And if the game didn't feel empty for 5v5, would it feel too chaotic with 7v7? It gives them the synergy, it cuts down on the queue times, it lets everyone still be able to play their game at extra DPS, allows people to queue more, but also people enjoy the role. That's a good thing. People want to play those characters. I think that's a really great thing to have in a game. Could it even be feasible though because of I'm just gonna say it because probably can't. The Switch probably can't handle it. So is it even feasibly possible? That's kind of what I wanted to know.
It would be, I think, like we'd have to do work, you know, for 6v6, 7v7 would probably be harder, you know. I can't promise that it would be
7v7
harder.
would be an
Like I
unbelievable.
haven't
Like,
like
there's so
actually
many
talked
unknown
to our
variables to
engineers
that.
about it. Sometimes things that you think ought to be easy are hard, and sometimes things that you think ought to be hard are kind of like easy. And so like there can be surprises. So I guess I don't have like a great answer for you there. It is interesting though when you talk about like, you know, like, hey, maybe that would bring queue times
I've
down.
gotta
I
go
don't
in
think
15
it would
minutes,
bring them
chat.
down as much, but like there are like a bunch of in between versions of what we're talking about where it's like, well, what if queue times were only like 20% worse, you know? And what if some of the social problems were only 10 or 20% worse? And you kind of come up with this other format where it's like, oh, hey, we've kind of like solved a lot of the problems. And like kept a little bit of the old ones, but not as much as we used to have, like in the world of OpenQ, or the world, even worse, the world of like No Limits or something like that. There's maybe
no
like
offense to
some
Flats, I just feel
versions
like
of
this
the
is not
game in there
productive.
that actually work for everybody.
Maybe, well-
you know, but it's like kind of hard to talk about what those would be.
I
but
just
like,
I don't think
I'm open
I
to
think
it.
that's step 3 or 4, and we're at step 1
I
and 2.
think I'd like to come in at this point actually, because I think that this is something you've kind of alluded to, like you've alluded to around it. I feel a few times in this call, Aaron, and it, you know, like Flats, I was wondering if I'd have to pitch my idea to you, but I think that like you've kind of already shown like a propensity just the way you're talking. I feel like you guys have already explored a lot of this, which is just what I want to talk about is the hybrid open queue.
Mhm.
You mentioned it in the blog where you're like,
This
we're actually looking at
is intriguing.
a hybrid open queue system. I think for all the people who are 6v6
This
enjoyers,
could be the best of
there's
both
also
worlds.
a section of people who are open queue enjoyers, right? And maybe they don't get,
Well,
you know, they're
open
not
queue
quite so loud
solves
because it arguably
the,
is an
the
open
hero
queue
design
already,
issues
but
of 5v5.
that's really difficult because it's not really a seriously balanced mode. It's not really given much attention. But there is a charm to the open queue. There, it helps with queue times. It is a better way potentially to like for some people to enjoy. What is your, you know, where are you at basically? Because you kind of alluded to your experimenting with it. So what are the ideas you have, and where are you at in terms of exploring a hybrid or open QE system for Overwatch 2?
Yeah, I can touch on this one a little bit. I think one of the things we're looking at with our experiments, there are important elements to any format we implement long term, right? We need to be able to make games swiftly, make sure those games are quality. We need to make sure that long term we think they're healthy and can be balanced too. I think well, we're gonna try some, you know, max 2 variants for sure. I think there's an element there of, you know, even in the 5v5 format, are there hybrids? I think there's like the first question everyone has is like 5v5 or 6v6. I think like our job as designers is to be like, actually there's like C, D, E, F, G, like we can keep going, right? Bunch of different options we can always look at and try to learn from. So I think I actually saw your video many months ago about that max too. So I think we're gonna like experiment with some sort of format there, and but I think there's some questions of do we want to try another format where that solo player actually gets a bonus of some sort. If you are that, say you're the solo tank and you're playing 1-2-2 again, but it's actually open queue format and you're playing against two tanks. It's gonna be rather difficult. Do we need to give you something, or you're the solo support on a 2-2-1 team? And you have to do all that healing. Do you need something too? I think there's a question there, something we might experiment with too.
There we
So,
go, Alec. Okay,
that
you're
in
getting
particular,
interesting here. You've
we
piqued
use
my
a lot of
interest,
other
Alec.
Problems, fun, not necessarily fun ones, but fun ones to think about.
You've piqued my
There's, like,
interest,
how do we do the
Alec.
rating in that? Like how many people are
Outside
actually
the
flex?
box, look at that.
Are certain people locked into the roles of the game? Like maybe 3 of them are. So you always have to have a tank, a support, and a DPS at least, right? You have that at a minimum, and then 2 flex people come in.
There you go, Alec.
So I think there's some matchmaking
You're barking up the
concerns
right
there, but
tree now.
There's some stuff we want to try there, and throw out to the player base where some of these experiments might be flawed, right? But we want to get them in front of players just to see how they react and be able to learn from
Now
them.
you're talking, Alec.
Yeah,
now you're
and,
talking.
I think something like that max too. That's more of a 5v5 test, because all that really
That
is
just shows that
2-2-2
asymmetrical
and-
game can't work because all these
and
other stuff.
66.
Yes, it is hard.
You know,
It is
but, like,
very hard.
there are-
Yes,
even in the world of 5v5 tests like that, I think could be very interesting.
it's
like,
hard.
We've talked about
It's
like,
hard to do, and I agree. I
what it
don't
was
think it would be
like,
better
you
than
know,
6v6.
before
But
roll
if you're
queue
going to make
was
5v5
implemented in the
work,
game,
that's
right?
what you
You'll,
have to
you'll
do.
get into a match with like 5 DPS or something like that. That was just the start of the match. Typically, by the time you got halfway through that match, like most of the time, not every time, you kind of had a comp. Like people are just swapping and they're trying to make answers, and so like, I don't think open queue is like the right answer for the main part of the game, right? Yes, we do have a community there. It's actually our third, like permanently the third most popular game mode after ranked and quick play. Like it's I think it's like close to like 10% of like player hours are just in like open queue.
Oh
right? There's,
shit,
like,
well,
there's
that's a
still
lot
decent
more than
amount
I
of
thought.
people
Okay.
playing that mode. That being said, I don't think that we want it to be the main mode, but that flexibility of being like, hey, can our DPS just swap the tank even if it's just for a little bit? Like we just want to do a particular thing without going all the way into that world of like, well, let's just have 5 DPS or whatever. I think that there could be something there that would be fun. The 6v6 side of it becomes more complicated, and also like there's a lot of versions of this where people might feel like they're being forced to play a particular role. Like there's ways you can implement this. Like it's funny, the way that we play test internally is something we just call role limits. It all means is it's open queue. Everyone goes into one of our play tests, and once you get 2 people to select DPS is just locked out, right? And so like there's versions of this that we could implement that could be like that, but suddenly it still means like if you were to do this and put this into comp, your tank player might not actually be a tank player on your team as you get into that. It does get into some of what we were talking about earlier, which is like, yeah, but is that good enough?
No.
There's a drawback there where you're going to feel like you're at a disadvantage, but is it worth it in order to have a system where you don't have really long queue times, and you're still able
Craftman,
to
open
have
queue's
a
not
different
actually
format of the game.
balanced. Is the
Maybe
thing.
it's not.
All they did was
right?
reduce health pools. They didn't actually
But I
sit down
think
and
it's
try to
probably
balance it.
worth talking about more. It's another reason why we said this is like this.
This has been a good
blog
show.
piece was like an introduction to the community.
This has been a great
you know?
show. This has
It's
been a
like,
great episode.
We'd like to start talking about some of this with you. So whether it's like a 2 or some of this with the community, it's like whether it's a 2 like hero limit per role, in 5v5, or whether there's some sort of other role limit that we end up doing for a 6v6 play test. It'd be nice to start working through some of that. I think we have a few that we want to run, and we'll probably be doing it in season 13. But other than that, yeah, like let us know.
I mean, that sounds super interesting. Flats, I have a follow-up on that one, but do you want to interject anything?
I took way too much time. You got the rest of this, all you.
No, thank you. I don't even know if I'm allowed to ask this actually, but so if you
Oh, no.
want to decline, feel free to say no. But I love that to hear that you're experimenting. I think 10% actually sounds like a really surprisingly high number. You're telling me that 10% of player hours are in open queue. I'm like, wow, I would have never guessed that.
It might
And
be
that's
more
a
like
mode-
9, and it always kind of goes up and down. But yeah,
Sure.
it's
It's
pretty
still,
high.
like for me, I'm like, wow, because that's a mode that nobody really pays attention to. But do you? It's great to hear that you're experimenting, but do you kind of? There's been a lot of Overwatch. I'll say clones. We might say generously competitors that have been kind of coming around recently. Do you look at them and kind of get lessons from them, like relearn some lessons? Because they're kind of a lot of them. One that rhymes with Arvel Kivels is kind of going through a lot of the same decisions that earlier Watch went through. Does having them experiment for you in some way, does that kind of give you
absolutely. It's so much fun to
It
watch
could.
it.
We're always looking at other games. You like how I just turned this into like a generic answer?
That's
but-
totally fine. I don't expect you to be
Well,
always necessarily be able to answer this.
absolutely. It's fun to
Yeah, I don't want
watch.
to talk about a specific game, but yeah, well, we look at other games
It's
and we try
fun
to
to
learn
watch.
from
It's
other
fun.
games, and like it'll be interesting to see how some of these other games
Tackle this.
whether they
it's
change
cool.
over
It's cool
time
to see it
also,
happen. It's fucking awesome.
I think there is like a pretty decent part of the gaming community, especially when you talk about the free to play community, that kind of jumps from game to game, and so the ones that don't, they kind of become like your core audience, and your core audience
vary.
will start, like they're going to have
vary.
opinions on the way the game ought to go, and they're going to play it a certain way, and then it's like in a competitive game, they could start finding issues in the game, and like every dev team, worth their salt is going to have to examine the issues that come up in that game and see what they do to solve them. So it will be nice to be able to watch other game teams like work through issues and see what they do to solve them. Did that answer it?
That's a great answer.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was. Just,
I'm
it
glad
just
he
came
said
to my
that.
mind,
That
so I
means they're paying
apologize for
attention.
Kind of, like,
It's
just
good.
throwing it out there.
Honestly, this has been a great episode.
You
You did it in an okay way. It wasn't too bad.
I don't like
Okay.
barring questions, like I don't obviously want to go into an interview where you just like dodge for an hour straight, like that. No one's
No,
going to
yeah.
want to watch that, but like you shouldn't feel like you're walking on eggshells.
Well, yeah, I don't want to put you in an awkward position either. So, because I appreciate you giving us your time and
You're
talking
such a nice
openly to the
guy.
community.
How are you such a nice guy?
I think even then it kind of like, competition's good. It's healthy, and it starts to crystallize what makes your game special too, and helps you hyper focus on those things. I think Overwatch is very special for a lot of reasons, and I think a lot of that is like the love and care we put into our heroes, and hopefully like that's clear to people too. But I think that competition's great. I think it just makes you focus even more and makes it clear to players and yourselves like what are the competitive advantages that you have over other games.
Dude, that was like a great answer. I that's my answer also to that question.
Okay. So scratch that back. We'll edit this in post. When this goes on YouTube, we'll just take straight up Alex answer. I think it's a really I think it's a really good way of putting it. I actually want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, which is that talking about like, hey, we're listening to you guys. Like you kind of brought up the 6v6 thing, so we listen to you guys. I kind of have two joint questions. One is like, well, how does the community get ideas to you? Because if I can be frank, you guys won't be able to necessarily say this, but like the 6v6 conversation was very loud for very long. It was like a lot of noise for a long time, and then we get this blog. I'm pretty sure we don't necessarily want that every time. We don't want huge divisive discussions every time before something gets thought about or talked about or addressed. So well, how does the community get ideas to, like, when there's a section of the community who are like, we really believe in this, how does that happen?
I was gonna
And
go,
B,
but I want to hear what you have to say.
How
to this.
much are you willing to kind of let the community do their experiments?
Maybe don't ridicule
Maybe empower them to do their experiments.
people who like the first
With
game.
6v6, there's like a code that people are playing in the workshop. I'm sure the workshop community would love more powers to be able to kind of run more tests and play. So those are my kind of joint questions. Like, how do you see the community's role in all of this?
It's pretty huge. So there's a bit of a history to this conversation, and actually like looking at it now and looking
have to
at
go here in a
the
second, guys. I've got a play
response
test I can't miss.
to the blog piece, we'll see what it is to this discussion, right?
It's been good.
I
This is
kinda
a
wish
great
maybe we had
discussion.
talked about it a little bit
This
sooner.
is all it needed to be.
There is a funny story here. Like I wrote a different blog piece last December it wasn't as good as this one, you know. And I'm like, hey, I think it's time for us to like talk to the community about 6v6 because it has been consistent, but there's been up and down to it, you know. Like sometimes it's the thing that the community talks about the most. Sometimes the community is talking about other aspects of the game, you know. And so like
Shit, I need to go.
with this
Fuck.
one, like it was basically we were gonna like throw this blog piece over the wall and then we were all gonna go on like vacation, you know, for the holidays. And so we didn't really feel that comfortable about it. And then at the same time, the like at least back then, because we hadn't looked into some of the considerations of what we would need to do to really get 6v6 running, it was a little bit harder for us to talk about, right? To where like imagine you run 6v6 tests and everybody loves it, and then you're like, cool, we're not doing anything with that, you know, because we can't, right? And so like I think for us, we wanted to do enough work to where like before we actually talked
So they were
to
ready.
the community about it, we would know that it's like, hey, if we were actually going to like look into
That
this
gaslighting makes a lot
seriously,
more sense.
we would need to know that
That's all
we
I'm
would
gonna
be
say
able
about
to
that one.
actually deliver on something for our players. So some of that delay was us kind of like doing a little bit more due diligence in order to avoid kind of like shooting ourselves in the foot here. And then I think that like
I get it, you know.
and it would be cool to hear from you guys. I know we're running out of time here, but like to me, I think this particular topic is unique and it's different from a lot of the other ones that have come up. I hope that like the community thinks that we're more open and responsive in our communication to other like topics in the game than we have been to this one, you know. So it's like we have a community team that is like kind of like really like not just like working with different parts of the community, but like really following along with those conversations. We have a lot of people on the team that also do, like Alec, you know, like earlier is like, hey, he's like watched every one of the Group Up podcasts, you know. So it's like we're on Twitter, we're on socials, we're like collecting information that people bring in.
And I give them credit, they've been way more
talking about it
responsive.
and reacting to it in game. And I guess like I'd apologize if it feels like we're not actually doing that based off of the way that the conversation around 6v6 has gone.
That's what it felt like.
Yeah, I
Not
think
from
it was,
them.
It was hard to talk about, as you said, because of some of the noise early on, trying to get a clear read on everything. I think what helped over time was some of the more level-headed conversations, like your format and some other formats where, you know, people would talk about their side of it when they were actually trying to and be reasonable, you know. And I think over time, like I think actually like in the last 6 months, it's actually gotten better and better, that conversation in some sense, even if it did maybe get loud in some places. So I think people just coming together and trying to objectively talk about the pros and cons of both formats, I think that brought a lot of clarity to the conversation and what people were actually saying, what they actually wanted, rather than some of maybe the polarizing conversations that were happening early on.
That's great to hear. Flats, any thoughts you want to share on that?
I mean, Aaron knows. Like we had our first interview. That was one of the things I wanted to talk about, and they were like, "We want to talk about it later." And I was like, I was not happy with it. I was like, okay, like I'll take your word for it, and here they are.
It made it
on
way
so
worse.
I appreciate that a lot.
But I appreciate the clarity now.
It's so tough. Like I felt pretty bad about that one too. And like maybe there was a different way to handle some of that.
Look, water under the
felt
bridge at
like
this point. Water under the bridge.
Otherwise, I was just gonna kind of like,
you know,
dodge it probably during the interview, and that probably wouldn't have felt that great either.
I knew you guys were taking it serious though, because it was like you told me, it was like
we're
gonna talk about it, just like not right now. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna just be honest with people. And when I led into it, I was like, I know everyone wants me to ask the 6v6 question. I'm not. I was asked not to, but they said they'll talk about it later. And here we are later, talking about it and moving forward with an experiment and seeing how it goes. So I think these little things are going to matter a lot in the long run with your core community, people that actually follow all the stuff. A little bit difficult on the greater gaming community, or people who you maybe used to play Overwatch. Those people maybe don't play anymore. Obviously, that's a little bit tougher. But like, to tie it all back to the beginning of this this podcast, I think those little things really do re-strengthen that trust. So thank you.
Yeah, totally. And I know
They
we're
do.
going
I
over,
gain a
but
lot
then
of
here's
respect
a
for them here for
question
this.
you. Like
This
that
is what
was
needed
a
to happen.
pretty lengthy blog piece with a lot of detail in it, and we've typically tried to keep them shorter than that. Do you guys have like a preference here?
Longer,
You know,
more,
what?
more,
More.
longer. Honestly, you mentioned earlier that you only put one graph in because like you
Put
don't
all
want
of
to like
them.
overload.
Put all of them. I'll
I
break
want,
every single
I
one
would
of them
like
down.
more because
I would
Yeah.
break every single
personally,
one of those down.
I probably, at least my head
And then we can give
was
you more
beginning
insight.
Overwatch 2 tank queues were probably longer because it was more fun as opposed to like season 9, post season 9, where like everyone's having a bad time. It was probably instant, right? So like I would love more info like that, and I think that us having that data to dig into is really important because like I'm just gonna spell it all out right now. There's a lot of people out there that think Overwatch is a dead game, and I think they think that when you say there's millions of people that play every day, they're probably looking at this and going, "I call bullshit. There's no way," because they don't have the Steam charts. Because the Steam charts is not what most people play on, and if you look at the Steam charts, it's quite low in comparison to say Apex or something like that, right? But we have BattleNet, you have console. There's a lot of other things that play into that, so you have numbers we don't have. All that type of information will always, I feel like, do better.
And we could
Or
give them
reflect
better
for
feedback
you,
too.
as opposed to like
our
holding it closer to the
hands are
chest. So
tied.
that's
know?
how I feel about it.
We have a lot of
Yeah,
stuff we have to
that's really-
speculate on.
Oh, go
It's
ahead,
very
I was gonna
hard to
say, I
give
think that
them
information
honest feedback.
has helped everyone have better conversations about the topic too. I think a lot of it early on, why I can get maybe so much fervor around is like people don't have the information, so they're just kind of
It's hard.
they just have ideas of what may be the information. But I think that was really an important step for us to kind of like, hey, we're laying it out for you. Here's what it is, and I think we'll just keep doing that. We'll make sure we
Thank
dig
you.
into some of the topics.
Dude,
even
I'm
deeper.
telling you, dude.
Maybe not as deep
I
as
fuck
this
with
one,
Alec
Aaron. I don't know if
Dawson,
we need
dude.
to-
I like
don't know
this
if there's
guy.
anything that
I
needs a
like this
9K
guy,
essay on in the game, but maybe like 5.
I like this guy,
right?
dude.
So maybe
I
something.
like this guy.
That's pretty amazing. You know, like as far
That's
like,
my
as far as, like,
QB1.
giving players more information. Like one thing we do talk about internally sometimes is like how we could potentially give people like a little bit more access to some of our data, not all of it. You know, like it's not really like part of Blizzard to give out like player numbers and stuff like that. But like as far as like balance and stuff like that, I think that there's like
I don't really care about player numbers,
for
to be
the
honest.
type of
Q rates
game
is
we
what I care
are and
about.
the type of audience we have, something like that. I think would be
Like you said,
really
the last
useful
bounce back.
to
You gotta
that
do the balance.
community.
What do you want them to do?
It
It's
is a
the only way
decent
they can
amount of
make
work
tank.
though, and
People
so
can't
it's
fucking
like
roll in this
if we were to
format.
ever do something like that in order to like get something like that going,
All right, I gotta go.
it's
I'm
there's
sorry,
like
boys.
there's a lot of
Look.
planning we'd have to put around it in
I'm-
order to make sure it's not taking away from.
Sorry, boys. I have a playtest I have to go to. Thank you all for coming. That was a great show. Shout out Aaron and Alec for being transparent and not just being, it'll never come back. Why are we wasting our time? You know, it's like absolute. This is my point the whole time. It was everything's on the table. If they decide to do something, they can do it. So you know, it's worth having the conversation when the actual gameplay it's not solvable. The gameplay offering ultimately, I think, is what should get prioritized first. The quality, because that's what makes Overwatch stand out from the rest of the pack, in my opinion. I could be wrong, and we might have to accept the fact that we could be wrong, and we could be stuck in 5v5. But you'll never get there without a real conversation about what's actually happened after the experiment. It's like making a hypothesis going into the experiment and then being like, oh, well, let's not talk about the results. It's like, no, we need to talk about the results. Like, we have to talk about the results. So, yeah, look, I really appreciate you guys. I got to go get this playtest done, though. I love you all. I will talk to y'all next time. Take care. Peace out. Much love. See ya.